They thought it was just a massive bull lying in the scorching heat, injured, motionless, strangely peaceful. Two hikers spotted him there beneath the unforgiving South Dakota sun, his gray hide caked with dust, breathing so shallow it barely moved his enormous chest. He didn't charge when they approached. He didn't even lift his head. He just stared with those deep, knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets darker than the prairie night. When the rescue team finally arrived, Dr. Sarah Lightfoot knelt beside the giant animal, but what she discovered hidden beneath his massive body made her face drain of all color. What was there, or rather, who was there, would shatter everything they thought they knew about loyalty, love, and the bonds that transcend death itself. Because this isn't just a story about a dying bull. This is a story about a promise kept beyond the grave, a love so fierce it defied nature itself, and a truth so powerful it would change lives forever. 1 year later, the Standing Bear Ranch had transformed into something that would have made Joseph proud beyond measure. The Prairie Winds Animal Sanctuary sprawled across the rolling hills like a testament to the power of second chances, housing over 40 rescued animals ranging from abandoned cattle to injured wildlife that had found their way to this haven of healing. Spirit had become the undisputed patriarch of this unlikely family. Now fully recovered and magnificent in his prime, he moved through the pastures with the dignity of an elder statesman, teaching newcomers the unspoken rules of sanctuary life. The two calves he had saved, now strong yearlings named Hope and Promise, had grown into confident young cattle who seemed to inherit their protector's gentle wisdom and fierce loyalty to those in need. Dr. Sarah Lightfoot stood on the front porch of the renovated ranch house, watching Spirit guide a group of recently rescued horses toward the water trough. Jake Littlefeather had become her indispensable partner in running the sanctuary, his wildlife expertise proving invaluable in caring for the diverse population they served. Maria Redbird had established a traditional healing center in one of the converted barns, where ancient Cherokee and Lakota wisdom complemented modern veterinary medicine in ways that seemed to accelerate every animal's recovery. The sanctuary had gained national attention, drawing visitors from across the country who came to witness the miracle of Spirit's story. But more importantly, it had become a beacon of hope for animals who had lost everything, proving that love could indeed transcend every boundary of species, circumstance, and loss. Each evening at sunset, Sarah would find Spirit standing in the same spot where Joseph Standing Bear used to watch his cattle graze. The great bull would survey his domain with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of all he had experienced, the loss, the sacrifice, the ultimate triumph of love over desperation. Hope and Promise would stand beside him like sentinels, having learned from their protector that true strength came not from size or power, but from the willingness to shield others when the world grew dark. As the prairie wind carried the sounds of contented animals across the golden grassland, Sarah understood that they had created something eternal here. This was more than a sanctuary. It was proof that the bonds between souls could survive anything, that love multiplied when it was given freely, and that sometimes the most magnificent legacies were built not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of staying when everyone else walked away. The morning that would change everything began like any other at the Prairie Winds Animal Sanctuary. Sarah Lightfoot was making her rounds through the pastures, checking on the 43 rescued animals that now called Standing Bear Ranch home, when she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Spirit was standing motionless by the eastern fence line, his massive head raised and alert, staring intently at something in the distance that she couldn't see. This wasn't unusual behavior for the great bull who had become the sanctuary's beloved patriarch. Spirit often positioned himself as a sentinel, watching over his extended family with the dedication of a born guardian. But there was something different about his posture today, a tension in his shoulders, an alertness that spoke of recognition rather than mere vigilance. Sarah approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tones that had become second nature around the animals. What is it, old friend? What do you see out there? Spirit's ears flicked toward her voice, but his gaze never wavered from whatever had captured his attention beyond the fence. He rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that Sarah had learned meant he was processing something important, something that required careful consideration. Following his line of sight, Sarah squinted against the morning sun and finally saw what had transfixed him. In the distance, barely visible against the golden prairie grass, 3 small figures were moving slowly across the landscape. Even from half a mile away, she could tell they were cattle, young ones, by their size and uncertain gait. "Jake!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the yard to where Jake Littlefeather was repairing a section of fence near the barn. "Bring the binoculars. We've got visitors coming in from the east." Jake jogged over with the field glasses, his Navajo heritage evident in the quiet way he moved and observed before speaking. He trained the binoculars on the distant figures and let out a low whistle. 3 calves, maybe 4 months old. They're in rough shape, Sarah. Moving slow, probably haven't eaten in days. Maria Redbird emerged from the traditional healing center she had established in the converted barn, drawn by the commotion. Her Lakota intuition had always been finely tuned to disturbances in the natural order, and she immediately sensed the significance of what was happening. "They're not lost," she said quietly, watching Spirit's reaction to the approaching animals. "Look at him. He knows they're coming. He's been waiting for them." It was true. Spirit's entire demeanor had shifted from alert watchfulness to something that could only be described as anticipation. His tail swished once, twice, a sign of controlled excitement that Sarah had learned to recognize over the past year. As the morning progressed, the 3 calves drew steadily closer to the sanctuary. Word spread among the animals with that mysterious communication system that exists in all communities, whether human or otherwise. Hope and promise, the yearlings that Spirit had saved in the creek bed over a year ago, took positions flanking their protector. The rescued horses gathered near the fence, nickering softly. Even the sanctuary's collection of barnyard fowl seemed to sense that something important was happening. "Should we go out and help them?" Jake asked, his hand already moving toward the medical kit he always carried. "No," Sarah said firmly, though her veterinarian's instincts screamed at her to intervene. "Spirit knows what he's doing. Let him handle this his way." They watched as the 3 exhausted calves finally reached the fence line. The smallest one, a little red heifer with white markings around her eyes, collapsed just feet from where Spirit stood. The other 2, slightly larger but equally depleted, stood swaying on unsteady legs. Spirit moved then, with a grace that belied his massive size. He approached the fence and began making soft, encouraging sounds, the same gentle rumbling he had used to comfort hope and promise during their darkest hours. The calves responded immediately, struggling to their feet and pressing against the fence where they could touch noses with the great bull who somehow represented safety in their desperate world. "My God," Sarah whispered. "It's happening again." Jake was already moving toward the gate. "I'll get them into the quarantine pen, start them on fluids, and—" "Wait." Maria's voice carried an authority that stopped them both. "Watch. Something else is happening here." She was right. Spirit had moved to the gate himself and was systematically working the latch with his massive head, something they had never seen him do before. The mechanism was designed to be cattle-proof, but Spirit approached it with the focused intelligence of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. The gate swung open. For a moment, nobody moved. The calves stood just outside the sanctuary, exhausted and afraid. Spirit stood just inside, offering entry to safety but not forcing it. It was an invitation, not a rescue, a choice, not a compulsion. The smallest calf, the little red heifer who had collapsed moments earlier, took the first tentative step into the sanctuary, then another, and another. Her companions followed, drawn by the promise of safety that Spirit's presence represented. Once all 3 calves were inside the perimeter, Spirit gently nudged the gate closed with his shoulder. Then he positioned himself between the newcomers and the world beyond the fence, just as he had done for Hope and Promise in the creek bed where they had first found him. "I'll be damned," Jake muttered. "He's taking them in." And just like that, Sarah was already moving toward the quarantine area, her medical training overriding her amazement. The calves needed immediate attention, fluids, nutrition, treatment for whatever had driven them to seek refuge at the sanctuary. But even as she worked, her mind was racing with questions that had no easy answers. Where had these calves come from? How had they known to come here? And most importantly, how had Spirit known they were coming? The answers began to emerge over the following days as Sarah and her team nursed the 3 newcomers back to health. The calves were indeed about 4 months old, weaned but still vulnerable. They bore the faded remnants of ear tags from a ranch Sarah didn't recognize, but the tags were too damaged to provide useful information. More telling were the signs of prolonged stress and malnourishment. These weren't animals who had simply wandered away from their home ranch. They were survivors of something traumatic, animals who had been on their own for weeks or possibly months. Jake's investigation into missing cattle reports turned up the answer they had been seeking. 3 weeks earlier, a truck carrying livestock had overturned during a severe thunderstorm about 30 miles north of the sanctuary. The driver had been injured and hospitalized, and in the chaos that followed, several calves had escaped into the wilderness. Search parties had been organized, but the vast expanse of prairie made finding 3 frightened animals nearly impossible. After 2 weeks with no sightings, the insurance company had written them off as a total loss. The calves were presumed dead. But they weren't dead, Maria observed as they watched the 3 newcomers tentatively exploring their new home under Spirit's watchful eye. They were traveling. They were looking for something. Looking for what? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. But for him, Maria said simply, nodding toward Spirit, for someone who would understand what they needed. It was a mystical explanation, but Sarah had learned to respect the wisdom that Maria brought from her traditional Lakota upbringing. After everything they had witnessed with Spirit's original rescue of Hope and Promise, the idea that animals might possess their own forms of communication and knowledge no longer seemed far-fetched. The integration of the 3 newcomers into the sanctuary's community happened with remarkable ease. Spirit took charge of their rehabilitation with the same patient dedication he had shown Hope and Promise. He taught them where to find the best grass, how to approach the water troughs without crowding, and most importantly, how to trust the humans who cared for them. Hope and Promise, now confident yearlings, seemed to understand their role as older siblings. They included the newcomers in their play, showed them the boundaries of their new territory, and demonstrated by example that this place was safe, that the humans here could be trusted. But it was Spirit's behavior that truly amazed everyone who witnessed it. The great bull had somehow transformed from a rescued animal into something approaching a spiritual guide, a being who understood that his role was to offer sanctuary not just through his physical presence, but through his wisdom and experience. He's building something here, Sarah told Jake one evening as they watched Spirit settle down for the night surrounded by his growing family. Not just protecting individual animals, but creating a community, teaching them how to heal, how to trust again. Jake nodded thoughtfully. My grandfather used to tell stories about animals like Spirit, guardian spirits who took physical form to help others. Said they appeared when they were needed most, in places where healing had to happen. As if to confirm Jake's words, Spirit lifted his massive head and looked directly at them, his intelligent eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. In that moment, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with being entrusted with this remarkable animal's mission. The sanctuary was no longer just a place where injured animals came to recover. It was becoming something unprecedented, a destination for animals who had lost their way, a beacon that somehow called to those who needed sanctuary most. And at the center of it all was Spirit, the bull who had redefined everything they thought they knew about animal intelligence, compassion, and purpose. The turning point came on a scorching August afternoon when Sarah received a phone call that would challenge everything they had built at the Prairie Winds Animal Sanctuary. The voice on the other end belonged to Thomas Crow Dog, a Lakota elder and member of the tribal council, and his words carried the weight of authority and deep concern. "Dr. Lightfoot, we need to talk," Thomas said without preamble. "It's about Spirit and what you're doing out there at the old Standing Bear place. There are people asking questions, and some of them aren't friendly." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Over the past year, the sanctuary had operated quietly, deliberately staying below the radar of regulatory agencies while they established their protocols and built their reputation. But success had brought visibility, and visibility had apparently brought scrutiny. "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The kind that come from people who see dollar signs when they look at 20,000 acres of prime grazing land," Thomas replied grimly. "Word is that some developers from back east have been sniffing around, talking about challenging Joseph Standing Bear's will. They're claiming the land transfer wasn't legal, that a Lakota man couldn't leave property to someone outside the family without tribal approval." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If the will was successfully challenged, not only would she lose the sanctuary, but Spirit and all the animals they had rescued would be displaced, possibly separated, their carefully built community destroyed. "Is there any validity to their claim?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Legally, probably not. Joseph's will was properly executed, and the land was never held in tribal trust. But legal validity and political reality are two different things. If enough pressure gets applied in the right places, they could tie you up in court for years. And in the meantime, we couldn't operate," Sarah finished. "The animals would have to be relocated." "Or worse," Thomas said quietly. "Some of these developers are talking about livestock auctions, about liquidating assets to pay legal fees. Dr. Lightfoot, they don't see Spirit as a guardian or hope and promise as survivors. They see market prices and profit margins." After hanging up, Sarah walked out to the main pasture where Spirit was conducting his evening routine, a slow, methodical patrol of the fence line that ensured all his charges were safe and accounted for. The three newest arrivals, now healthy and confident after 6 weeks at the sanctuary, stayed close to his massive frame as he moved through the golden afternoon light. Watching Spirit's gentle authority over his adopted family, Sarah felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. These animals had been through enough trauma. They had found safety, built relationships, learned to trust again. The idea of disrupting their peace for the sake of corporate profit felt like a betrayal of everything Joseph Standing Bear had entrusted to her care. Jake found her there an hour later, her face set in lines of determination that he had learned to recognize. "Thomas called me too," he said without preamble. "Told me about the developers." "We're not going to let this happen," Sarah said firmly. "I don't care what it takes. These animals aren't going anywhere." "Agreed," Jake replied. "But we need to be smart about this. Fighting lawyers with lawyers is expensive, and time is on their side, not ours." Maria joined them as the sun began to set, her intuitive understanding of the situation evident in her troubled expression. "The ancestors are restless," she said quietly. "I've been feeling it for days, a disturbance in the balance here. Now I know why." That evening, the three partners sat around the kitchen table in the ranch house, surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and tribal regulations as they tried to find a way to protect what they had built. The sanctuary's operating costs were manageable, but a prolonged legal battle would drain their resources quickly. "What about tribal recognition?" Maria suggested. "If we could get the tribal council to officially recognize the sanctuary as serving a traditional cultural purpose, it might provide some protection." Jake shook his head. Thomas already thought of that. The council is split on the issue. Some members support what we're doing, but others are concerned about setting precedents for non-tribal ownership of traditional lands. Sarah studied the copies of Joseph's will and the supporting documents, looking for any angle they might have missed. There has to be something, she muttered. Joseph was too careful, too thoughtful to leave loopholes that could be exploited. It was Jake who noticed the detail they had all overlooked. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a paragraph in Joseph's will that they had previously dismissed as standard legal language. The bequest includes all livestock, both present and future, permanently residing on the property. Most wills would specify animals by breed or number, but Joseph left it open-ended. Sarah frowned. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Joseph knew exactly what he was doing," Jake replied slowly. "He wasn't just leaving you the land. He was creating a legal framework for exactly what we're doing now. Every animal that comes to the sanctuary becomes part of the bequest, protected by the same legal documents that protect the land itself." Maria's eyes widened as she grasped the implications, which means that removing the animals from the sanctuary would require not just challenging the land transfer, but also proving that each individual animal doesn't belong here. And how do you prove that Spirit doesn't belong on the land where he's lived for most of his adult life? The legal strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, but it would only work if they could prove continuous operation of the sanctuary as Joseph had intended, which meant they needed documentation, witnesses, and most importantly, they needed to demonstrate that what they were doing served a legitimate purpose that benefited the broader community. Over the following weeks, Sarah and her team worked frantically to build their case. They documented every rescue, every rehabilitation success, every animal that had found sanctuary on the ranch. They gathered testimonials from veterinarians, ranchers, and tribal members who had witnessed the positive impact of their work. Most importantly, they organized a community open house that would demonstrate the sanctuary's value to anyone who cared to see it. The event was scheduled for the third weekend in September, and invitations went out to tribal leaders, local ranchers, state officials, and members of the media. The response was overwhelming. Word of Spirit's story had spread far beyond the boundaries of South Dakota, and animal lovers from across the country began making plans to visit the sanctuary. But Sarah knew that the most important attendees would be the local community members, who would have to live with whatever decision was made about the sanctuary's future. The night before the open house, Sarah couldn't sleep. She walked out to the main pasture where Spirit was lying peacefully, surrounded by the animals he had taken under his protection. Hope and promise flanked him like sentries, while the three newer arrivals slept curled against his massive sides. Other rescue animals had arranged themselves in a loose circle around the group. Horses, sheep, even a family of pigs that had been abandoned after their owners lost their farm to bankruptcy. "You know what's happening, don't you?" Sarah said softly to Spirit. "You know that people are trying to take this away from us." Spirit lifted his massive head and looked at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the prairie. He rumbled softly, a sound that Sarah had learned meant acknowledgement, understanding, and something that could only be described as trust. "I won't let them separate your family," Sarah promised.
"Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, you're all staying together." As if in response to her words, Spirit rose to his feet with surprising grace for such a massive animal. He walked to the fence where Sarah stood and gently pressed his forehead against her shoulder, a gesture of affection and solidarity that brought tears to her eyes. Standing there in the starlight with Spirit's warm bulk pressed against her, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with being chosen as the guardian of something precious. Tomorrow would bring challenges that could destroy everything they had built, but tonight, all was peaceful in the sanctuary that love had created. The battle for the future of Prairie Wind's Animal Sanctuary was about to begin, and Sarah knew that the outcome would determine not just the fate of Spirit and his extended family, but the legacy of Joseph Standing Bear's vision of a place where love transcended all boundaries of species, blood, and circumstance. The morning of the community open house dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden September light that made the South Dakota prairie look like something from a painting. Sarah stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching as volunteers set up information booths and guided tour stations throughout the sanctuary grounds. Despite her nerves about the day ahead, she couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished in just over a year. Cars and trucks began arriving by 9 o'clock, creating a steady stream of visitors that would continue throughout the day. Among the early arrivals were several members of the tribal council, including Thomas Crow Dog, who had come to offer his support despite the political complications surrounding the sanctuary's status. Sarah recognized several local ranchers, some veterinarians from surrounding counties, and a handful of reporters from regional newspapers. But it was the unexpected arrival of a black sedan with government plates that made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. Two men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicle, and even from a distance, their demeanor suggested they weren't here as casual visitors. Jake appeared at Sarah's elbow, having noticed the same arrival. "Lawyers," he said grimly, "probably representing the development group." "Let them come," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. "We've got nothing to hide here." The first tour group of the day included a mixture of local residents and visitors from as far away as Minnesota, who had driven down specifically to see Spirit and learn about the sanctuary's work. Sarah led the group personally, starting at the main pasture where Spirit held court over his extended family like a benevolent patriarch. "This is Spirit," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the group of 30-some visitors. "He's the reason this sanctuary exists, and in many ways, he's still the heart of everything we do here." As if he understood the importance of the moment, Spirit rose from his resting place and approached the fence with stately dignity. The 3 calves he had most recently taken under his protection followed closely, while Hope and Promise positioned themselves nearby like proud siblings showing off their father's wisdom. Over a year ago, hikers found Spirit collapsed in a creek bed 20 miles from here, Sarah continued, watching as the visitors were captivated by the gentle giant before them. He was dying of dehydration and exhaustion, but he wasn't alone. Beneath his body, he was protecting 2 orphaned calves who would have died without his sacrifice. An elderly woman in the front of the group raised her hand. "Are those the same calves?" Sarah smiled, pointing to Hope and Promise. "Those are Spirit's first rescues, now healthy yearlings. But since then, he's taken in 3 more orphaned calves, and his protective instincts seem to extend to every animal that arrives here needing sanctuary." As if to demonstrate the point, one of the rescued horses approached the fence and nickered softly at Spirit, who responded with a gentle rumbling sound that seemed to communicate reassurance and affection. The interaction drew appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. "What makes Spirit's behavior so remarkable," Sarah explained, "is that it defies everything we thought we knew about bull behavior. Male cattle typically don't involve themselves in caring for young, especially young that aren't their own offspring. Yet Spirit has created what can only be described as an extended family, teaching newcomers how to integrate into the herd and providing protection for those who need it most." One of the local ranchers, a weathered man named Bill Morrison, who had known Joseph Standing Bear for decades, stepped forward. "I've been raising cattle for 40 years, he said in a voice loud enough for the entire group to hear. "Never seen a bull behave like this. Joseph always said Spirit was special, but this goes beyond special. This is something that changes how you think about animals altogether." The endorsement from a respected member of the ranching community carried weight with the mixed group of visitors, and Sarah could see attitudes shifting as people began to understand that they weren't just looking at an unusual animal, but witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, emotion, and purpose in the animal world. The tour continued through the rehabilitation facilities,
where Maria demonstrated some of the traditional healing methods she used to complement conventional veterinary care. Visitors watched as she worked with a young horse that had arrived severely traumatized, using a combination of herbal remedies and gentle energy work that seemed to calm the animal in ways that medication alone had not achieved. Many of our animals arrive with physical injuries, Maria explained to the group, but almost all of them carry emotional trauma as well. They've been abandoned, abused, or separated from their families. Healing their bodies is only part of our work. We also have to help them learn to trust again, to form new relationships, to find their place in a community that will value and protect them. Jake led a portion of the tour through the wildlife rehabilitation area, where they cared for injured native species before releasing them back into the wild. He explained how the sanctuary's location and resources made it an ideal staging ground for conservation efforts throughout the region, and how their work supported biodiversity and ecosystem health across thousands of acres of prairie habitat. But it was the return to Spirit's pasture that provided the most powerful moment of the day. As the tour group gathered for final questions, a small commotion near the fence caught everyone's attention. A young calf that had arrived just days earlier, still skittish and uncertain, had wandered too close to the fence and become frightened by the crowd of strangers. Without hesitation, Spirit moved to position himself between the frightened calf and the perceived threat. But rather than showing aggression toward the humans, he simply stood as a barrier, his massive presence radiating calm authority. He rumbled softly to the young calf, who immediately moved to shelter behind his protective bulk. The demonstration of Spirit's protective instincts and emotional intelligence left the tour group silent for several moments. Finally, the elderly woman who had asked the first question spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "In all my 78 years," she said, "I've never seen anything like this. This isn't just an animal. This is a teacher, a healer, a guardian. Anyone who would try to destroy what you've built here doesn't understand what they're looking at." The sentiment was echoed by murmurs of agreement from throughout the group, and Sarah felt a surge of hope that their message was getting through. But her optimism was tempered by the knowledge that the two lawyers representing the development interests had been taking notes throughout the tour, their expressions giving away nothing about their intentions. As the day progressed, tour after tour moved through the sanctuary, each group leaving with a deeper understanding of what made this place special. Local television news crews arrived to document the story, and by afternoon, social media was buzzing with photos and videos of Spirit and his extended family. The most significant moment came late in the afternoon when Thomas Crow Dog addressed the largest gathering of the day from a makeshift stage near the main barn. As a respected tribal elder, his words carried weight with both the Native American community and the broader population of ranchers and local residents. "This land has been home to my people for generations," Thomas began, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "We understand the connection between humans and animals, the responsibility that comes with being caretakers of the earth and all its creatures. What Dr. Lightfoot and her team have created here honors that responsibility in ways that would make our ancestors proud." He paused, looking out over the crowd that included tribal members, ranchers, visitors from across the region, and the two lawyers who had been observing everything with professional detachment. Joseph Standing Bear was a good man who understood that the highest use of land is not the one that generates the most profit, but the one that serves the greatest good, Thomas continued. He chose Dr. Lightfoot as his successor because he knew she would honor the sacred trust that comes with caring for this place and these animals. The Tribal Council supports the sanctuary's mission and recognizes it as consistent with our traditional values of stewardship and respect for all living things. The statement was more than Sarah had dared to hope for, an official endorsement from tribal leadership that would make any legal challenge significantly more complicated. But even as she felt relief washing over her, she noticed the lawyers exchanging glances and making additional notes. As the crowd began to disperse in the early evening, one of the lawyers approached Sarah directly. He was a tall, thin man with steel-gray hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested high-powered legal representation. "Dr. Lightfoot," he said, extending a business card. "I'm Richard Blackstone, representing the Midwest Development Corporation. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss a proposition that might interest you." Sarah took the card, but didn't look at it. "I'm not interested in any propositions from development companies, Mr. Blackstone." Blackstone smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You might want to hear this one before you decide. We're prepared to offer you 5 times the assessed value of this property, plus relocation assistance for your animals to established sanctuaries throughout the region. It would solve all your problems and provide you with the resources to start fresh somewhere else." The offer was staggering. More money than Sarah had ever imagined having. Enough to secure her future and continue her work on a smaller scale elsewhere. But as she looked past Blackstone to where Spirit stood watching over his family in the golden evening light, she knew there was only one possible answer. "Mr. Blackstone," Sarah said quietly, "you're talking about breaking up a family that's taken over a year to build. You're talking about destroying something precious and irreplaceable for the sake of profit. The answer is no." Blackstone's smile faded. "I hope you'll reconsider, Dr. Lightfoot, because with or without your cooperation, this land is going to be developed. It would be much easier for everyone if you chose to work with us rather than against us." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The battle for the sanctuary's future was about to become a war, and she was beginning to understand just how powerful the forces arrayed against them really were. The legal assault began 3 weeks after the open house, arriving in the form of a thick manila envelope delivered by certified mail on a gray October morning. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the documents inside. A formal challenge to Joseph Standing Bear's will, accompanied by an injunction that would freeze all operations at the sanctuary pending resolution of the legal dispute. The papers were dense with legal terminology, but the core argument was devastatingly simple. The developers claimed that Joseph Standing Bear had been mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, suffering from dementia brought on by his heart condition. They argued that no rational person would leave 20,000 acres of valuable land to someone he barely knew, and that the unusual provisions regarding Spirit's care were evidence of diminished mental capacity. "This is insane," Jake said, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "Anyone who knew Joseph could tell you he was sharp as a tack right up until the day he died." "Insane or not, they've got enough money to make it stick in court," Sarah replied grimly. "Look at this list of expert witnesses they're planning to call. Psychiatrists, medical experts, even a veterinary behaviorist who's going to testify that Joseph's beliefs about Spirit's intelligence were delusional." Maria emerged from the traditional healing center with a sage bundle in her hands, her face set in lines of grim determination. "The spirits are angry," she announced. "I've been feeling it for days, a darkness gathering around this place. These people don't understand what they're trying to destroy." The injunction was the most immediate threat. It prohibited the sanctuary from taking in any new animals and required them to cease all operations that weren't directly related to basic animal care. More ominously, it authorized court-appointed monitors to inspect the facility and ensure compliance with the order. "What about the animals we already have?" Sarah asked their lawyer, a soft-spoken Lakota attorney named Daniel White Elk, who had been recommended by Thomas Crow Dog. "Can they force us to relocate them?" Daniel studied the documents with the careful attention that had made him one of the most respected legal advocates in the region. "Not immediately," he said finally. "But if they succeed in overturning the will, the new owners could demand removal of any animals they consider inconsistent with their intended use of the property." The implications were staggering. Spirit and his extended family, who had spent over a year building their bonds and establishing their routines, could be scattered to facilities across the country. Many of the older or more traumatized animals might not survive the stress of relocation and separation from their established social groups. That evening, Sarah walked out to the main pasture where Spirit was conducting his usual sunset survey of his domain. The great bull moved with his characteristic dignity, checking on each member of his extended family with the patience of a devoted patriarch. Hope and Promise stayed close to his sides, while the three newer calves followed in his wake like devoted disciples learning the ways of sanctuary life. "They want to take this away from you," Sarah said softly, approaching the fence where Spirit often came to greet her. "They want to break up your family and turn this place into strip malls and housing developments." Spirit approached the fence and pressed his massive forehead against Sarah's shoulder in the gesture of affection that had become their ritual. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, a tension that suggested he understood far more about the current crisis than any animal should be capable of comprehending. "You know, don't you?" Sarah whispered. "You know that we're in trouble." As if in response to her words, Spirit turned and looked back at his assembled family. One by one, the other animals seemed to sense his attention and moved closer to the fence. Horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, even the small flock of rescue chickens that had appointed themselves as the sanctuary's unofficial alarm system, they all gathered in an unprecedented display of unity that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The next morning brought the court-appointed monitors, a team of 3 officials whose job was to ensure compliance with the injunction. They were polite but thorough, documenting every aspect of the sanctuary's operations and taking extensive photographs of the facilities and animals. The lead monitor, a middle-aged woman named Janet Rodriguez, seemed genuinely impressed by what she saw. "I have to say, Dr. Lightfoot, this is one of the most professionally run facilities I've ever inspected. The animal care standards here exceed anything required by law." "Thank you," Sarah replied, though she knew that professional competence might not be enough to save them from a legal system that prioritized property rights over animal welfare. "What I don't understand," Rodriguez continued, "is why anyone would want to shut this down. You're providing a valuable service to the community, and these animals are clearly thriving under your care." Sarah showed Rodriguez through the rehabilitation areas where Maria was working with a recently rescued horse that had arrived severely traumatized from an abusive situation. The animal, which had been virtually untouchable when it arrived, now stood calmly as Maria applied traditional healing techniques that complemented the veterinary treatment. "This mare was destined for slaughter when we got her," Sarah explained. "She'd been so badly mistreated that most people would have considered her beyond help. But Maria's methods, combined with the calming influence of the other animals, have helped her learn to trust again." Rodriguez watched as the traumatized horse interacted peacefully with several of Spirit's adopted calves, her professional demeanor softening as she witnessed the healing power of the sanctuary's community approach. But it was their visit to Spirit's pasture that provided the most dramatic demonstration of what made the sanctuary special. As the monitoring team approached the fence, Spirit immediately positioned himself between them and the younger animals under his protection. It wasn't aggressive behavior, but rather the calm assertion of authority by a guardian who took his responsibilities seriously. "I've never seen a bull behave like this," Rodriguez murmured, watching as Spirit systematically ensured that each of his charges was safely positioned behind him. "It's almost like he's conducting a head count." "Spirit understands his role here better than most humans would," Sarah replied. "He's not just another animal we're caring for, he's an active participant in the healing process for every creature that arrives here." As if to prove the point, a young calf that had arrived just days before the injunction began calling out in distress, apparently upset by the presence of strangers. Spirit immediately moved to comfort the frightened animal, rumbling softly and positioning his massive bulk to provide both physical and emotional shelter. The demonstration of Spirit's protective instincts and emotional intelligence left even the professional monitors visibly moved. Rodriguez made extensive notes in her report, documenting not just the facilities and procedures, but the unprecedented level of interspecies cooperation and care that characterized the sanctuary's approach. However, the legal pressure was mounting from multiple directions. The developers had hired a team of expert witnesses who were prepared to testify that the sanctuary's operation was inconsistent with proper land use and that the animals would be better served in conventional facilities designed specifically for their species. More troubling was the psychological evaluation they had commissioned on Joseph Standing Bear, based on interviews with family members who had been estranged from him in his final years. The resulting report painted a picture of an elderly man whose judgment had been compromised by grief over his wife's death, and whose attachment to spirit represented a form of delusional thinking. "They're building a narrative," Daniel White Elk explained during a strategy meeting in the ranch house kitchen. "They want the court to see Joseph as a lonely old man who lost touch with reality and made irrational decisions about his legacy." "But that's not who Joseph was," Sarah protested. "Everyone who knew him can testify to his mental clarity and sound judgment." "Everyone who knew him well," Daniel corrected. "But most of those people are from the Native American community, and the developers' lawyers are going to argue that they're biased witnesses with their own agenda for keeping the land out of development." Jake slammed his fist on the table in frustration. "So they get to rewrite history to fit their profit margins. They get to destroy Joseph's reputation just to steal his land?" "That's exactly what they're trying to do," Daniel replied grimly. "And unless we can find a way to prove that Joseph's decision was not only rational, but prescient, they might succeed." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria had been spending her evenings going through Joseph's personal papers, looking for anything that might support their case, when she discovered a locked metal box hidden behind books in his bedroom closet. Inside were financial records that painted a very different picture of Joseph Standing Bear's final years than the one the developers were trying to present in court. "Look at this," Maria said, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "Joseph wasn't just some lonely old man making irrational decisions. He was a shrewd businessman who had been tracking land values and development pressures in the region for over a decade. The papers showed that Joseph had received multiple offers for his ranch over the years, each one higher than the last, as developers recognized the potential value of his property. But rather than accepting the increasingly lucrative offers, he had systematically documented his reasons for refusing them. "He knew exactly what he was doing," Sarah breathed, reading through Joseph's careful notes about soil conservation, water rights, and the importance of preserving open space for wildlife migration. This wasn't the whim of a confused old man. This was the deliberate decision of someone who understood both the financial and environmental implications of his choices. Most importantly, the papers included a detailed plan for the sanctuary that Joseph had been developing for years before his death. He had researched animal rescue operations across the country, consulted with veterinarians and animal behaviorists, and even commissioned architectural plans for facility improvements that matched exactly what Sarah and her team had implemented. "He had been planning this for years," Jake marveled, looking at architectural drawings that showed proposed expansions to the barn and rehabilitation facilities. Joseph didn't choose Sarah randomly. He had been preparing for this transition long before he died. The discovery transformed their legal strategy completely. Instead of defending against claims of mental incompetence, they could now demonstrate that Joseph's bequest was the culmination of years of careful planning and research. The sanctuary wasn't the product of an old man's confused attachment to his bull. It was the fulfillment of a vision that had been decades in the making. But even as their case strengthened, the pressure from the developers intensified. Anonymous phone calls began arriving at all hours, warning Sarah to accept their buyout offer before they were forced to pursue other options. Equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested sabotage, and several of the sanctuary's supporters received visits from private investigators asking probing questions about their relationship with the facility. The message was clear. The developers were prepared to use any means necessary to acquire the Standing Bear Ranch, and they had resources that dwarfed anything Sarah and her team could bring to bear. The battle for the sanctuary's future was escalating beyond legal maneuvering into something that felt increasingly like warfare. Standing in Spirit's pasture on a cold October night, watching the great bull settle down surrounded by his extended family, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like a physical force. These animals depended on her to protect not just their physical welfare, but the bonds they had formed and the community they had built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to destroy what they had created. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of the prairie, Sarah made a promise to Spirit and all the animals under his protection. Whatever it took, however long the fight lasted, she would not let their family be torn apart. The war for the heart and soul of the Standing Bear Ranch was just beginning. The tragedy struck on a bitter November morning when the first blizzard of the season roared across the South Dakota prairie with a fury that seemed to embody all the darkness gathering around the sanctuary. Sarah woke to the sound of wind howling like a living thing and snow driving against the ranch house windows with the force of thrown sand. By dawn, the world had disappeared into a white void that made visibility beyond 50 feet impossible. Emergency weather alerts crackled across the radio, warning of life-threatening conditions and urging everyone to stay indoors. But even as Sarah listened to the warnings, she knew that staying inside wasn't an option. The animals needed her, and in weather like this, a few hours of neglect could mean the difference between life and death. Jake and Maria arrived at the ranch house despite the impossible driving conditions, their vehicles barely visible through the swirling snow.
"Power's out across 3 counties," Jake reported, stamping snow off his boots. "Generator's running, but we need to check on all the animals, make sure they have adequate shelter." The 3 of them bundled into heavy winter gear and ventured into the storm, following fence lines and familiar landmarks to navigate between buildings that had been rendered invisible by the blizzard. The wind was so fierce that conversation was impossible. They communicated through hand signals and stayed close enough to maintain physical contact. Most of the animals had taken shelter in the barns and outbuildings, huddled together for warmth while the storm raged overhead. But as they made their way toward the main pasture, Sarah's heart sank. Through the driving snow, she could see a dark shape lying motionless near the far fence line, too large to be anything but Spirit. "No," Sarah breathed, the word torn away by the wind as she struggled through knee-deep drifts toward the fallen bull. Jake and Maria followed, their faces grim with the same terrible realization. They found Spirit collapsed on his side, his massive frame partially buried by snow that had already begun to accumulate around him. But it wasn't the storm that had brought him down. Even through the swirling whiteness, Sarah could see the dark stains spreading beneath his body, could smell the metallic scent of blood that the wind couldn't disperse. "Gunshot," Jake said grimly, kneeling beside Spirit's head while Maria worked to clear snow from around his body. "Single shot to the chest, close range." Sarah's hands shook as she examined the wound, her veterinary training warring with the horror of what she was seeing. The bullet had struck Spirit high in the chest, damaging vital organs but missing his heart. He was still breathing, but each breath was labored and painful. "We need to get him inside," Sarah said, though even as she spoke, she knew the impossibility of moving an 1,800-pound animal in these conditions. "Jake, radio for the emergency transport. Maria, help me stop this bleeding." But even as they worked frantically to stabilize Spirit's condition, Sarah's mind was reeling with the implications of what had happened. This wasn't random violence or poaching. Someone had deliberately shot Spirit, using the cover of the blizzard to carry out an attack that was clearly intended to destroy the heart of the sanctuary. The worst part was Spirit's eyes. Despite his pain and the shock of his injuries, the great bull's gaze kept moving toward the other animals who had taken shelter in nearby buildings. Even dying, his first concern was for the safety of his extended family.
Where are Hope and Promise? Sarah asked suddenly, realizing that Spirit's two original rescues were nowhere to be seen. Where are the other calves? Jake raised his head from the radio, his face pale with more than cold. Emergency transport is stuck on Highway 83. Roads are completely impassable. We're on our own until this storm breaks. The reality of their situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Spirit was dying from a gunshot wound, the other animals were scattered and potentially in danger, and they were cut off from any outside help by the worst blizzard in decades. Whoever had done this had planned it perfectly, ensuring that there would be no witnesses and no possibility of rescue. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Sarah felt something shift in the air around them. Through the howling wind, she heard a sound that made her heart leap, the calling of cattle, growing closer with each passing moment. Hope and Promise appeared through the snow like ghosts, their young voices raised in distress calls that cut through the storm. Behind them came the three newer calves, and behind them a procession of other sanctuary animals who had somehow found their way through the blizzard to where their protector lay fallen. "They're coming to him," Maria whispered, her voice filled with awe despite the circumstances. "They know he's hurt, and they're coming to help." One by one, the animals of Spirit's extended family arranged themselves around his fallen form. The horses positioned themselves as windbreaks, their large bodies helping to shelter the smaller animals from the worst of the storm. The cattle pressed close, sharing their body heat with their injured patriarch. Even the pigs and sheep found places in the protective circle, creating a living shelter that no human structure could have provided. Sarah had seen remarkable displays of animal intelligence and cooperation during her career, but nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed in that howling blizzard. Without any human direction, Spirit's family had organized themselves into a rescue operation, using their combined presence to keep their leader alive until help could arrive. "We need to get medical supplies," Sarah said, her voice steadier now that she saw the animals' determination to save their protector. "If we can't get Spirit to help, we'll bring help to Spirit." Working in relay teams to minimize exposure to the storm, they ferried medical equipment from the ranch house to the makeshift shelter the animals had created. Sarah administered pain medication and antibiotics while Jake worked to construct a more substantial windbreak using tarps and fence posts. Maria prepared hot water bottles and heating pads powered by the portable generator they had hauled through the snow. But it was the animals themselves who provided the most crucial care. Hope and Promise took turns lying against Spirit's back, their body heat helping to maintain his core temperature. The horses continued to shield the group from the worst of the wind, while the other cattle formed an outer perimeter that trapped warm air and deflected the driving snow. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself fighting not just Spirit's injuries but her own growing certainty about who was responsible for the attack. The timing was too convenient, the method too calculated. Someone had used the blizzard as cover to eliminate the one being whose presence made the sanctuary's mission undeniable. "This wasn't random," she said to Jake during one of their brief respites in the ranch house. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that Spirit was the heart of everything we've built here." Jake nodded grimly. "And they knew that if they could eliminate him, the rest would fall apart. No Spirit, no story. No story, no public support. No public support, no legal standing." The developer's strategy was becoming clear with horrible precision. They couldn't attack the sanctuary directly without generating negative publicity, but they could eliminate its most visible symbol and then claim that the facility was no longer serving its intended purpose. With Spirit gone, they could argue that the sanctuary had lost its reason for existence and that the land should be put to more profitable use. But as Sarah looked out at the circle of animals maintaining their vigil in the storm, she realized that the developers had made a crucial miscalculation. They had focused so intently on Spirit as an individual that they had failed to understand what he had created, a community bound by something stronger than mere survival instinct. The other animals weren't just gathered around Spirit because he was their leader. They were there because they understood, in ways that transcended species barriers, that he had given them something precious, a place where they belonged, where they were valued, where their own capacity for love and loyalty could flourish. By nightfall, the storm had begun to weaken, and the emergency transport team finally fought their way through to the sanctuary. The veterinary team that accompanied them was prepared for a routine evacuation of an injured animal, but what they found defied their professional experience. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Michael Whitehorse said as he surveyed the scene. "These animals have created a field hospital. Look at how they've positioned themselves to provide maximum protection and warmth. This is sophisticated cooperative behavior that challenges everything we think we know about animal intelligence." The transport to the veterinary center was conducted with the same careful coordination the animals had shown throughout the day. Hope and Promise insisted on riding in the trailer with Spirit, their presence clearly providing comfort to their injured protector. The other animals watched from the sanctuary fence as the convoy disappeared into the clearing night, their vigil continuing even in his absence. At the veterinary center, the medical team worked through the night to stabilize Spirit's condition and repair the damage from the gunshot wound. The bullet had been removed, but the trauma to his internal organs was severe, and his chances of survival remained uncertain. Sarah maintained her own vigil in the observation room, watching through the glass as Spirit fought for his life with the same determination he had shown in protecting his family. Tubes and monitors surrounded the great bull, but even in his weakened state, his eyes remained alert, searching for the animals he had spent his life protecting. "He's asking for them," Sarah said to Dr. Whitehorse during one of his hourly checks. "He doesn't understand why his family isn't here." Dr. Whitehorse studied Spirit's vitals with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades caring for large animals. "His physical condition is stabilizing, but there's something else going on here. It's like he's holding back, like he's afraid to commit fully to recovery because he doesn't know if his responsibilities are being met." The insight crystallized something that Sarah had been sensing but hadn't been able to articulate. Spirit's recovery wasn't just a matter of healing his physical wounds. He needed to know that his family was safe, that his work at the sanctuary could continue, that his life's purpose hadn't been destroyed by a single act of violence. As dawn broke over the prairie, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Sarah made a decision that would either save Spirit's life or risk everything they had worked to build. She was going to bring his family to him, regardless of hospital policies or medical protocols, because sometimes, she realized, the most important medicine couldn't be measured in dosages or administered through IV lines. Sometimes healing required the presence of those we love, the knowledge that our sacrifices have meaning, and the assurance that the bonds we forge in life can survive even our darkest moments. The battle for Spirit's life was about to become a testament to the power of family, the resilience of love, and the unbreakable connections that bind all living things together in ways that transcend understanding but demand recognition. The discovery that would change everything came not from the medical team fighting to save Spirit's life, but from Sheriff Patricia Whitehawk's methodical investigation of the shooting scene. 3 days after the blizzard, when the snow had melted enough to reveal the evidence, she found something that made her blood run cold: tire tracks leading away from a service road that bordered the sanctuary property, and most damning of all, a spent rifle cartridge that had been overlooked in the initial chaos of the rescue. The cartridge was distinctive, a high-powered hunting round that wasn't commonly available in local sporting goods stores. More importantly, it bore microscopic markings that could be traced to a specific weapon if that weapon could be located. Sheriff Whitehawk had been investigating the developer's activities for weeks, following reports of intimidation and harassment from sanctuary supporters throughout the region. "This wasn't some random act of violence," she told Sarah as they stood in the veterinary center's waiting room, where Sarah had maintained her vigil for 3 days. "This was a professional hit, carried out by someone with military or law enforcement training. The shot placement, the timing, the use of weather as cover, this was planned and executed by an expert." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. "You're saying someone was hired to kill Spirit?" "I'm saying someone wanted your bull dead badly enough to pay serious money for it," Sheriff Whitehawk replied grimly. "And I think we both know who has that kind of motivation and resources." The revelation transformed the shooting from a random act of cruelty into something far more sinister, a calculated attempt to destroy the sanctuary by eliminating its most important resident. But even as Sarah grappled with the implications of what the sheriff had discovered, her attention was drawn back to the observation window where Spirit lay fighting for his life. The great bull had been showing signs of improvement over the past 24 hours, his vital signs stabilizing and his breathing becoming less labored. But Dr. Whitehorse remained concerned about what he described as Spirit's psychological state, a reluctance to fully engage with recovery that seemed to stem from anxiety about his separated family. "He's not giving up," Dr. Whitehorse explained to Sarah, "but he's not fully committing to getting better either. It's like he's conserving his strength for something, holding back until he knows his responsibilities are being met." Sarah understood exactly what Spirit was waiting for. Despite the hospital's policies against allowing livestock visitors, she had been planning to bring hope and promise to see their injured protector. Now, with Sheriff Whitehawk's revelation about the professional nature of the attack, she realized that reuniting Spirit with his family wasn't just medically advisable, it was essential for his psychological recovery. "I need to bring them here," Sarah told Dr. Whitehorse. "Hope and promise, and probably some of the others. Spirit won't fully recover until he knows they're safe." Dr. Whitehorse hesitated, clearly torn between medical protocol and his growing understanding of the unique bonds that existed within the sanctuary community. "Sarah, this is a sterile medical facility. We can't just—" "Then we'll set up an outdoor area," Sarah interrupted. "Somewhere Spirit can see them, hear them, know they're okay. Dr. Whitehorse, you've seen the evidence of what these animals mean to each other. Spirit nearly died protecting those calves once before. If he thinks they're in danger now, if he believes his injury has left them vulnerable, he'll never fully commit to recovery." The compromise they reached was unprecedented in the veterinary center's history. A temporary enclosure was constructed in the courtyard outside Spirit's recovery room, visible through the large windows that had been installed to provide natural light for recovering animals. The space was equipped with shelter, water, and feed, creating a safe area where Spirit's family could stay close during his recovery. The reunion that took place on Spirit's 4th day of hospitalization was unlike anything the medical staff had ever witnessed. As hope and promise were led into the courtyard enclosure, Spirit's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The great bull, who had been lying listlessly despite his improving vital signs, struggled to his feet and moved to the window that separated him from his adopted children. The sound he made, a deep, rumbling call that seemed to come from the very core of his being, brought tears to Sarah's eyes and sent every member of the medical staff rushing to witness what was happening. Hope and promise responded immediately, pressing against the glass and calling back with voices that conveyed relief, joy, and unmistakable love. "Look at his vitals," Dr. Whitehorse whispered, staring at the monitors that tracked Spirit's heart rate, breathing, and other crucial signs. "His stress indicators just dropped by half. His heart rate is stronger and more regular. This is better than any medication we could give him." Over the following days, as more of Spirit's extended family joined the vigil in the courtyard, the medical team documented recovery rates that defied conventional understanding of large animal medicine. Spirit's appetite returned with vigor, his wounds showed accelerated healing, and his interaction with the veterinary staff became cooperative rather than merely tolerant. But the most remarkable change was in Spirit's demeanor. The anxiety and restlessness that had characterized his early days in the hospital gave way to the calm authority Sarah remembered from his role at the sanctuary. Even confined to a medical facility, Spirit had somehow reestablished his protective watch over his family. The breakthrough in Sheriff Whitehawk's investigation came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rivera, a former security contractor who had been hired by the development company, contacted her office with information that would blow the case wide open. Rivera had been fired from his position after questioning orders that he considered unethical, and his conscience had finally compelled him to come forward.
They wanted me to conduct surveillance on the sanctuary, Rivera told Sheriff Whitehawk during a recorded interview. But it wasn't just observation. They wanted detailed intelligence on daily routines, security measures, animal locations. When I asked why they needed that level of detail for a legal challenge, my supervisor made it clear that they had other plans if the courts didn't go their way. Rivera's testimony revealed a conspiracy that went far beyond simple legal maneuvering. The development company had hired a team of private contractors to conduct what they euphemistically called asset reduction, the systematic elimination of animals that made the sanctuary's operation financially viable. Spirit had been the primary target because of his symbolic importance, but the plan included provisions for removing other key animals if necessary. They have a list, Rivera continued, his voice shaking with the implications of what he was revealing. Every animal at the sanctuary, with notes about which ones are most important to public support and which ones could be eliminated without generating too much attention. The evidence Rivera provided was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, financial records showing payments to private contractors, and most damning of all, detailed photographs of the sanctuary that could only have been taken during covert surveillance operations. Sheriff Whitehawk now had enough evidence to arrest several key figures in the development company, but she knew that the legal battle was far from over. Sarah learned about Rivera's revelations while sitting in the courtyard with Spirit, who had been moved to an outdoor recovery area that allowed for direct contact with his family. The great bull was clearly on the mend, his strength returning daily as he interacted with Hope, Promise, and the other animals who had maintained their vigil throughout his recovery. "They tried to murder him," Sarah said to Jake and Maria as they processed the full scope of what had been planned. "Not just Spirit, but potentially dozens of our animals. They were willing to commit mass killing to clear the land for development." Jake's face was grim with anger. "And they would have gotten away with it if Spirit hadn't survived. Who's going to investigate the death of a bull during a blizzard? Who would have suspected assassination rather than accident or natural causes?" But Maria saw the deeper significance of what had been revealed. "Spirit's survival isn't just about medicine or luck," she said quietly. "This is about something larger, about the responsibility we have to protect what's sacred from those who would destroy it for profit." The public response to the revelations was swift and overwhelming. News of the assassination attempt spread across social media and mainstream news outlets, generating outrage that transcended regional boundaries. Animal rights organizations, environmental groups, and Native American advocacy associations rallied to support the sanctuary, while law enforcement agencies at multiple levels launched investigations into the development company's activities. More importantly, the attempt on Spirit's life had revealed the true strength of the community he had helped create. Donations poured in from across the country, volunteers arrived to help with daily operations, and legal experts offered their services pro bono to ensure that the sanctuary's mission could continue. But the most significant change was in Spirit himself. As he recovered from his physical wounds, he seemed to understand that he had become more than just a protector of his immediate family. He had become a symbol of resistance against those who valued profit over life, progress over preservation, exploitation over stewardship. The attempted murder had failed to destroy the sanctuary's heart. Instead, it had revealed that heart to be stronger and more resilient than anyone had imagined. Spirit's survival was becoming a rallying cry for everyone who believed that some things were too precious to be bought, sold, or destroyed for the sake of development. As Sarah watched Spirit gently nuzzle Hope and Promise in the courtyard of the veterinary center, she realized that the battle for the sanctuary was entering a new phase. The developers had revealed themselves as willing to commit violence to achieve their goals.
but they had also awakened a opposition that was equally determined to protect what they had built. The war for the Standing Bear Ranch was about to become a test of whether love and community could triumph over greed and violence, whether the bonds forged between species could withstand the forces that sought to reduce everything to mere economic value. Spirit had survived his assassination attempt, but the real test of his legacy was just beginning. The revelation that would shatter everything Sarah thought she knew came not from Sheriff Whitehawk's ongoing investigation, but from an unlikely source. Patricia Standing Bear, Joseph's daughter-in-law, who appeared at the veterinary center on a crisp December morning carrying a manila envelope that trembled in her shaking hands. "Dr. Lightfoot," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I never told you about Joseph's will. Something I thought would die with me, but after what happened to Spirit." She paused, looking through the window at the great bull who was finally strong enough to stand for extended periods. "I can't keep this secret anymore." Sarah felt her stomach clench with foreboding. Over the past month, as Spirit had recovered from his gunshot wound and the legal battle had intensified, she had come to believe that all the mysteries surrounding Joseph Standing Bear's legacy had been solved. Now Patricia's haunted expression suggested that the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "What kind of secret?" Sarah asked gently, guiding Patricia to a quiet corner of the waiting area where they could speak privately. Patricia opened the envelope with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the clasp. Inside were documents that looked official: legal papers, medical records, and what appeared to be correspondence between lawyers dating back over 2 decades. "Joseph never told anyone the whole truth about Spirit," Patricia began, her voice gaining strength as she committed to the revelation. "We all thought Spirit was just a bull Joseph had purchased for breeding purposes, but that's not how Spirit came to the ranch. He was payment for a debt." Sarah frowned, not understanding the significance of what Patricia was trying to tell her. "What kind of debt?" 25 years ago, Joseph was diagnosed with early-stage heart disease. The doctors told him he needed surgery, but the family didn't have insurance that would cover it. We were looking at losing the ranch to pay for medical bills. Patricia's voice cracked with emotion. That's when Dr. Samuel Lightfoot stepped in. The mention of her grandfather's name hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known that Samuel Lightfoot had helped the Standing Bear family during the drought of 1952, but this was the first she had heard of any involvement with Joseph's medical care. "Your grandfather didn't just provide traditional healing," Patricia continued. "He used his connections in the medical community to find a surgeon who would perform Joseph's operation pro bono. He also helped us navigate the insurance system and provided financial assistance for the recovery period. Without Dr. Lightfoot's intervention, Joseph would have died in 1998. Sarah's mind was reeling, but she sensed there was more to come. "What does this have to do with Spirit?" Patricia pulled out a document that Sarah recognized as a contract, though the terms were unlike anything she had ever seen. Joseph insisted on repaying the debt, but Dr. Lightfoot wouldn't accept money, so they made an agreement. Joseph would provide a home for any animal that Dr. Lightfoot deemed in need of sanctuary for as long as that animal lived. The implications were staggering, but Patricia wasn't finished. Dr. Lightfoot died in 2010, but before he passed, he made one final request. He had been caring for a young bull, a Brahmin who had been rescued from an abusive situation. The animal was traumatized, aggressive, considered dangerous by most standards. But your grandfather saw something in him, some potential for healing and growth. Sarah felt the world shifting around her as the pieces began to fall into place. Spirit. Spirit was your grandfather's final rescue, Patricia confirmed. Dr. Lightfoot asked Joseph to take him in, to give him a chance to learn trust and purpose. Joseph agreed, of course. It was the least he could do for the man who had saved his life. The document Patricia handed her was a letter in Samuel Lightfoot's familiar handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her grandfather's words. My dear friend Joseph, this young bull carries deep wounds that cannot be seen but run to his very soul. He has known only cruelty and exploitation, and it has made him dangerous to himself and others. But I believe he has the capacity for great love if given the chance to heal. I entrust him to your care not because he will be easy to handle, but because you understand that the most broken spirits often become the strongest guardians once they learn to trust again. Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. I name him Spirit because I believe he will find his true purpose in your care.
And Joseph, there is something else you should know. This bull's bloodline traces back to the cattle that saved your great-grandfather during the winter of 1889. In a very real sense, you are not taking in a stranger, but welcoming home a distant relative whose ancestors once sheltered your own family from death. The revelation was overwhelming in its scope and meaning. Spirit wasn't just a bull that Joseph had grown fond of. He was the fulfillment of a sacred debt, the continuation of a relationship between families that spanned generations, and most incredibly, the descendant of cattle that had once saved Standing Bear lives during one of the harshest winters in Dakota history. But there's more, Patricia said, producing another document from the envelope. Dr. Lightfoot's letter also contained instructions for what should happen to Spirit after Joseph's death. He specifically requested that if anything happened to Joseph, Spirit should be placed in the care of his granddaughter, Dr. Sarah Lightfoot, who had inherited his gift for animal healing. Sarah stared at the document in shock. Her grandfather had died when she was in veterinary school, but somehow he had anticipated not only Joseph's death, but also her own career path and calling to work with traumatized animals. Dr. Lightfoot included one more provision, Patricia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. He left a sealed letter for you, to be opened only if Spirit ever came into your care. Joseph kept it in his safe all these years, waiting for the right moment. With shaking hands, Patricia handed Sarah an envelope bearing her name in her grandfather's careful script. Inside was a letter that would change her understanding of everything that had brought her to this moment. My beloved granddaughter, if you are reading this letter, then Spirit has found his way to you as I always knew he would. The bull you are caring for is not just any animal. He is the completion of a promise I made to the Standing Bear family, and the beginning of a legacy I pray you will continue. Sarah's grandfather went on to explain the full scope of his vision. I have spent my life learning that healing comes not from treating individual ailments, but from restoring the connections that bind all living things together. Spirit was my final lesson in this truth. When he came to me, he was broken not just by abuse, but by the loss of purpose and community. I healed his body, but Joseph healed his spirit by giving him a family to protect and a mission to fulfill. The letter continued with words that seemed to speak directly to Sarah's current situation. I know that forces will arise to challenge what you and Spirit build together. There are always those who see profit where others see purpose, who value possession over protection. But remember that Spirit carries in his bloodline the strength of ancestors who survived impossible hardships, and in his heart the wisdom of a bull who learned to transform suffering into service. The final paragraph brought tears streaming down Sarah's face. The sanctuary you create will be more than a refuge for wounded animals. It will be a place where broken spirits learn to heal by healing others, where love multiplies rather than diminishes when it is shared. Spirit will be your teacher in this work, as he was mine. Trust him, learn from him, and never forget that the most profound healing happens not when we cure individual ailments, but when we restore the sacred bonds that connect all life. As Sarah finished reading, she looked up to see Patricia watching her with a mixture of relief and apprehension. There's one more thing, Patricia said quietly. The developers don't know about any of this. They think they're just fighting over land and an unusual bull.
They have no idea they're trying to destroy something that represents over a century of interconnected relationships and sacred promises. The weight of this knowledge settled on Sarah's shoulders like a mantle of responsibility that stretched back through generations. Spirit wasn't just the heart of the sanctuary. He was the living embodiment of a promise her grandfather had made, the continuation of a relationship between families that had endured for decades, and the fulfillment of a vision that had been carefully nurtured across multiple lifetimes. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because Joseph made me promise to reveal it only if the sanctuary was truly threatened," Patricia replied. "He said that some knowledge was too powerful to share unless it was absolutely necessary. But after the assassination attempt, after seeing how far these developers are willing to go," she gestured towards Spirit, who was visible through the window, gently interacting with hope and promise. "I realized that keeping this secret might cost us everything our families have worked to build." As Sarah absorbed the full implications of what she had learned, she understood that the battle for the sanctuary had taken on dimensions that transcended property rights or even animal welfare. This was about honoring sacred promises, preserving generational relationships, and protecting a legacy that had been built through sacrifice and service across multiple families and species. The developers who had tried to kill Spirit thought they were eliminating an obstacle to their profit margins. In reality, they had attempted to destroy the living symbol of everything that connected the past to the future, the embodiment of promises kept and debts honored across generations. But now that Sarah knew the full truth about Spirit's origins and purpose, she also understood that the fight ahead would require more than legal maneuvering or public relations campaigns. It would require her to honor the trust her grandfather had placed in her, to fulfill the vision he had articulated decades before, and to ensure that the sacred bonds between families, both human and animal, remained unbroken despite all efforts to sever them. Looking through the window at Spirit, who seemed to sense the significance of this moment, and was watching her with those intelligent eyes that held decades of wisdom and purpose, Sarah felt the full weight of her inheritance settling around her like a blessing and a challenge combined. The war for the sanctuary was about to become something far greater than anyone had imagined. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning that would determine the fate of the Prairie Winds Animal Sanctuary. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with Daniel White Elk, surrounded by boxes of evidence that told the story of 3 generations of promises, sacrifices, and sacred bonds that the developers were trying to reduce to mere property disputes and profit margins. Judge Margaret Ironcloud, a respected Lakota jurist known for her wisdom and fairness, presided over proceedings that had drawn national attention. The gallery was filled with an unlikely coalition of supporters: tribal elders, local ranchers, animal rights activists, veterinarians, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Spirit's story and the sanctuary's mission. On the opposite side of the courtroom, the development company's legal team projected confidence born of unlimited resources and political connections. Richard Blackstone, their lead attorney, had built his reputation on acquiring properties for wealthy clients regardless of the obstacles, and he clearly viewed this case as another routine victory over sentimental opposition to progress. But the past month had transformed the legal landscape in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. Sheriff Whitehawk's investigation had resulted in multiple arrests, including the contractor who had shot Spirit and 2 executives from the development company who had orchestrated the assassination attempt. The revelation of the conspiracy had shifted public opinion dramatically in favor of the sanctuary. More importantly, Patricia Standing Bear's disclosure of the full truth about Spirit's origins had provided the legal foundation for arguments that transcended simple property law. This wasn't just about a will or land transfer. It was about honoring agreements that stretched back generations and protecting relationships that had been built through decades of mutual aid and respect. Daniel White Elk opened the sanctuary's case with a presentation that methodically laid out the historical context of Joseph Standing Bear's bequest. He detailed Dr. Samuel Lightfoot's role in saving Joseph's life, the agreement to provide sanctuary for animals in need, and the specific provisions that had brought Spirit to the ranch decades earlier. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood both legal precedent and cultural tradition, "this case is not about an eccentric old man leaving property to a stranger. This is about the completion of a sacred trust, the fulfillment of promises made between families who understood that some debts can only be repaid through service to something greater than themselves." He presented the evidence methodically: Samuel Lightfoot's letters, the medical records documenting Joseph's life-saving surgery, the contract establishing the sanctuary arrangement, and most powerfully, the documentation of Spirit's bloodline that connected him to cattle that had saved Standing Bear lives over a century earlier. But it was the testimony of the community members who had witnessed Spirit's work at the sanctuary that provided the most compelling evidence. Maria Redbird spoke about the traditional healing practices that had been integrated with modern veterinary care, creating treatment protocols that were being studied by universities across the country. Jake Littlefeather presented data on the sanctuary's role in wildlife conservation, demonstrating how their work supported ecosystem health across thousands of acres of prairie habitat. His testimony was backed by endorsements from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and several university research programs. Thomas Crow Dog, representing the tribal council, testified about the sanctuary's cultural significance and its consistency with traditional Lakota values of stewardship and respect for all living things. His words carried special weight because they addressed the developer's earlier claims that the land transfer violated tribal sovereignty. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source: Dr. Michael White Horse, the veterinarian who had treated Spirit after the shooting. He took the stand not as an expert witness, but as someone who had witnessed something that challenged his understanding of animal behavior and medical science. "In 30 years of practicing large animal medicine," Dr. Whitehorse testified, "I have never seen anything comparable to Spirit's role at the sanctuary. This is not anthropomorphism or wishful thinking. This is documented, measurable behavior that demonstrates levels of intelligence, empathy, and social organization that we are only beginning to understand." He presented medical records showing the accelerated recovery rates of animals treated at the sanctuary compared to conventional facilities, along with behavioral studies documenting the complex social structures that Spirit had helped establish among the rescue animals. "Spirit doesn't just live at the sanctuary," Dr. Whitehorse continued. "He actively participates in the healing process of other animals. He provides comfort to traumatized creatures, teaches social skills to those who have been isolated, and creates an environment where recovery happens faster and more completely than anything we can achieve through medical intervention alone." The defense's case relied heavily on attacking Joseph Standing Bear's mental competence and arguing that the sanctuary's operation was inconsistent with proper land use. They presented expert witnesses who testified that Joseph's attachment to Spirit represented delusional thinking and that leaving valuable property for animal care was evidence of diminished capacity. Richard Blackstone's cross-examination of the sanctuary's witnesses was aggressive and dismissive, clearly designed to portray them as naive idealists who were preventing the land from reaching its economic potential. He repeatedly emphasized the property's value for development and the jobs that commercial projects could create. But the developer's strategy began to unravel when Blackstone attempted to dismiss the significance of the relationships between families that had led to Spirit's placement at the ranch. His condescending questions about primitive beliefs and outdated traditions clearly offended Judge Ironcloud and many of the spectators. The turning point came when Sarah took the stand to testify about her grandfather's vision and her own experience caring for Spirit and the other sanctuary animals. She spoke quietly, but with absolute conviction about the bonds she had witnessed between species, the healing that occurred when animals felt safe and valued, and the responsibility that came with being entrusted with the care of traumatized creatures. Spirit has taught me that healing isn't something we do to animals, Sarah testified. It's something we do with them, in partnership, recognizing their intelligence and honoring their capacity for love and loyalty. What we've built at the sanctuary isn't just an animal rescue operation. It's a community where broken spirits learn to heal by helping others heal. When Blackstone attempted to dismiss her testimony as unscientific, Sarah calmly referenced the research data that documented the sanctuary's success rates and the academic studies that were analyzing their methods. But the moment that defined the entire trial came when Blackstone made a crucial error in judgment. Attempting to demonstrate that Spirit was just an animal with no special significance, he requested that the bull be brought to the courthouse so the judge could see that he was merely livestock, not the extraordinary being the sanctuary claimed. Daniel White Elk immediately agreed to the request, and arrangements were made to transport Spirit and several of his adopted family members to a temporary enclosure in the courthouse parking lot. The defense team clearly expected this demonstration to support their argument that the sanctuary's claims were exaggerated. What actually happened was nothing short of miraculous. As Spirit was led from the transport trailer, he immediately surveyed his surroundings with the calm authority that had made him legendary. Hope and Promise, now strong yearlings, flanked him like devoted children, while the 3 calves he had most recently rescued stayed close to his massive frame. The crowd that had gathered to witness this unprecedented moment fell silent as they watched Spirit's behavior. He wasn't agitated or confused by the strange environment. Instead, he seemed to understand the significance of the occasion, positioning himself where Judge Ironcloud could observe him clearly through the courthouse windows. When a young child in the crowd began crying, frightened by the large animals, Spirit's response left everyone speechless. The great bull approached the fence where the child stood and rumbled softly, the same gentle sound he used to comfort traumatized animals at the sanctuary. The child stopped crying immediately, reaching through the fence to touch Spirit's nose with complete trust. Judge Ironcloud observed this interaction from her chamber's window, along with the way Spirit systematically ensured that each of his adopted calves was positioned safely within his protection. The demonstration that was supposed to prove Spirit was ordinary livestock instead revealed the extraordinary intelligence and empathy that made him irreplaceable. The closing arguments took place the following day, with both sides summarizing their cases before a courtroom that felt charged with anticipation. Blackstone's final appeal focused on economic development and the need to prevent sentimental attachment from interfering with property rights. But Daniel White Elk's closing argument transformed the legal proceedings into something approaching a spiritual experience. He spoke about the sacred nature of promises made between generations, the responsibility that came with being entrusted with the care of vulnerable beings, and the kind of legacy that honored both the past and the future. Your Honor, Daniel concluded, this case is ultimately about what we value as a society. Do we measure worth only in dollars and development potential, or do we recognize that some things are too precious to be reduced to economic terms? Spirit and the sanctuary represent the best of what we can be, beings who keep promises across generations, who honor debts of gratitude, who understand that true wealth comes from the relationships we build and the love we share. Judge Ironcloud's ruling, delivered after 3 days of deliberation, would establish legal precedent for animal sanctuary protection and redefine the boundaries between property rights and moral obligations. But more than that, it would determine whether the bonds forged between Samuel Lightfoot and Joseph Standing Bear, between Spirit and his adopted family, between humans and animals who had learned to trust each other, could survive the forces that sought to reduce everything to profit margins and development potential. As the courtroom waited in absolute silence for the judge's decision, Sarah felt the weight of 3 generations of promises resting on this single moment, knowing that whatever came next would either honor the legacy of love and sacrifice that had brought them to this point, or destroy it forever in the name of progress and profit. For our listeners who remember when a handshake meant something, when promises were kept no matter the cost, when families, both blood and chosen, stood together through thick and thin. Spirit's story reminds us that love doesn't count the cost, loyalty doesn't ask for rewards, and sometimes the most profound families are the ones we choose to protect. In a world that often feels like it's forgotten these values, don't you find hope in knowing that somewhere, love still triumphs over greed? Haven't you experienced moments when someone, human or animal, showed you unconditional loyalty that restored your faith in goodness? Share your story in the comments below. When has an animal shown you love that humans failed to give? What moment of loyalty or sacrifice still brings tears to your eyes decades later?